Good morning. I'm glad we could come to you through this pre-recorded lesson this morning. I appreciate Bill helping with making this possible. I was scheduled to teach the lesson today, but as most of you know, we had to make plans to attend a funeral uh, yesterday, and so we pre-recorded this lesson so we could stay on track. As many of you have been praying for Zoe, you probably know now that she did uh, pass away about 11 days ago. She just turned 4 a couple weeks ago and has been battling leukemia for about the last 2.5 years. So please continue to pray for the Fugle family. That's Fugle, the Fugle family. And if you would pray for all those traveling today, including us traveling back home, we'd appreciate it. Our lesson is now 2 Samuel 15, and this is actually a two-part lesson. So as you know, since this is pre-recorded, we're not going to be able to pause and take comments or questions like I usually do. But never fear, the next installment, I will review and give you an opportunity for questions or comments if you have any in this, what we covered today. So we'll be teaching today. Next week is Easter, so we won't have Sunday school. Then the week after that, I'll be finishing chapter 15. So that's the plan. So let's look at 2 Samuel 15, and we're talking about Absalom. Now, Absalom has been 3 years in Geshur, and then he came back to Jerusalem, as you remember, and he spent 2 years kind of holed up in Jerusalem with no contact with the outside world. So it's been 5 years since the murder of Amnon and his banishment. And as we was covered last week, during those 2 years, there's been no interaction with David and really no real repentance or contrition on the part of Absalom. So that's where we left it at the end of chapter 14. But before we start chapter 15, I wonder if anybody has been having the same question that I've had, and that is that we talked about Amnon. Amnon was David's firstborn. And of course, we know that God had told David that Solomon would be the next king. But on a human level, the birth order was very important, especially for a king's family. So Amnon was the firstborn and would have been, on a human level, the heir apparent for the throne. Absalom was the thirdborn, and we're going to talk about him. Well, what happened to the number 2 son? So I've been thinking about that as we've been teaching through this, and finally decided I'm going to check it out. So turn with me to chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, and let's just review about David's family. So if you look at chapter 3, starting at verse 2, we're told that sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. His second, Chileab, by Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, and so on. So we know about Amnon. We're talking about Absalom. We will get to Adonijah, the fourth born, as we'll see later. He also has aspirations to be the next king. But what happened to his second son, Chileab? Well, you don't have to look too long because he's only mentioned here. And then in 1 Kings, when the genealogy is given, it's also mentioned that David's second son, only in 1 Kings, he's called Daniel. He evidently had 2 names, Chileab and Daniel. But they're the only mentions of David's second son. So why don't we know anything about him? Well, there's 2 good possibilities, or maybe more than 2, but some speculate that he died before adulthood. So it's possible that he never reached adulthood. That's why he's not talked about when we deal with these stories about David's family. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that he was a good kid. Maybe he just never got into trouble. He wasn't involved in the drama and the scandal of David's family, and so we never hear about him. So one of those 2 possibilities, or possibly some other reason, we don't know anything about his second son. So If you were wondering, now you know as much as I know about it. Okay, so let's get to chapter 15. Chapter 15 deals with Absalom's treason or his rebellion. And we see in the first 6 verses, we see his preparation or the prelude to rebellion. Let's go ahead and read the first 6 verses of chapter 15. It says, "After this it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision that Absalom would call to him and say, 'What city are you from?' And he would say, 'Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel.' Then Absalom would say to him, 'Look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you.' Moreover, Absalom would say, 'Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, then I would give him justice.' And so it was whenever anyone came near to bow down to him that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. In this manner Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel." So Absalom, we already know he had some things going for him. We've already been told that he was good looking. And then, just like now, good looks are always an advantage, especially when you're trying to get ahead and you have aspirations of greatness. So he had good looks. Well, now we're going to see he also was a smooth operator. We're told first off that he built himself an entourage. Verse 1 says, "After this it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him." Now, Absalom, he was a prince, but we're not really told that he had any official duties. He did not need an entourage, and it was not given to him. It wasn't provided by David or any official. He provided it for himself. He provided this huge entourage to go with him everywhere he went, including horses and chariots. Why did he do that? Of course, to look important, to look official. He was setting the stage to make people think that he was important. It really points out the arrogance and the hubris of Absalom. He had good looks. Now it's showing that went to his head. He thought he wanted to make himself look very important. He was very important in his own eyes. So he builds himself an entourage. Then we're told that he makes himself conveniently available at the city gate. It says in verse 2 that now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. Why the gate? Well, in that culture, the bigger cities, the city gate was kind of the unofficial city hall. It's where a lot of the business would be transacted. Even government business would take place at the city gate. It wasn't just a single gate, but there were buildings around the gate. And that's where a lot of business. So that's where he would camp out with his entourage. And he would then intercept people on their way to the king's offices. So when people were coming to Jerusalem to see the king's officials about some controversy or lawsuit, before they could get to the king's offices, Absalom would stop them, and he would let them know that he was willing to hear any of their concerns or controversies. In a word, Absalom was a politician, and a sleazy one at that. So here he was intercepting people on the way to the king, and then he would tell lies. He would say that officials were not available to hear his case. Verse 3, it says, "Then Absalom would say to him, 'Look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you.'" So he would be insinuating that the king was too busy for them and not concerned. He said the king hadn't provided proper staff to adjudicate their case. Then he says in verse 4, he would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, then I would give him justice." So what he is saying is, if I were in charge, I would do things differently. I would do things better. Sounds like a politician to me. And then beyond that, he would also show false interest and flattery. In verse 5, it says, "And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. Again, just like a politician, he was campaigning. He was making people think that, hey, you're important to me. And if I were in charge, I would see that you get the care and attention that you need. Well, he did this for a period of time, and gradually he gains the support of the people. We read in verse 6, in this manner Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Who did he steal the hearts of the men of Israel from? The king. These were men who were people that were loyal to King David, and gradually over time, Absalom was stealing their allegiance from King David to himself. Now you're wondering, what is David doing all this time? And apparently David is either unaware, which that I can't imagine if it's happening at the city gate, he's unaware, or he's not concerned. There is another possibility. Several scholars believe that David may not have been physically well during this time. And the reason they think that is there are several Psalms that could possibly be attributed to this time in David's life where he speaks of physical ailments. So some speculate that perhaps David wasn't well physically, and that's why this was able to be carried out right under his nose. And that may be why he didn't do anything about it. That's just a guess, but as we go through this chapter, that would seem to explain some of the actions that David takes or doesn't take. So that was Absalom's preparation. He's getting the scene set for some action now. And in verses 7 to 9, we see that the rebellion begins. Now, we need to make some comments about verse 7. Now, my Bible says, now it came to pass after 40 years. Now, your version either says 40 years or it may say 4 years. And either way, there's probably a footnote noted there. And the reason is that the oldest Hebrew text that we have of the Bible do say 40 years. However, there's reason to think that that was actually a transcription error, a copying error, at some point early in the process, and it was changed from 4 to 40. In fact, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, they have it down as 4 years. Several of the older Syriac versions say 4 years, and several of the historians, including Josephus, claim that it was 4 years. And really, 40 years just doesn't make sense in this narrative. So for sake of argument, we're going to accept that the correct translation is 4 years and not 40. Again, if you want to look into that further, but I'm convinced that it is supposed to be 4. So we'll read it as that. So verses 7 to 9. Now it came to pass after 4 years that Absalom said to the king, please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord. For your servant took a vow while I dwelt at Geshur in Syria, saying, if the Lord indeed brings me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said to him, go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. So for 4 years, evidently, Absalom has been doing his thing at the gate. He has been intercepting people, going to the king, telling them that he would be happy to help them, and if he were in charge, he could do things better. Well, now the time was right for Absalom to put his plan into action. And under false pretenses, he asked permission to go to Hebron. Now notice his pretense. What is his pretense? It's religious, right? He says that he made a vow while he was in Geshur, and he needs now to pay the vow. Now's the right time to go to Hebron and pay the vow. So we're pretty sure those were false pretenses, but he figures that's the best excuse to give to Hebron. Now, why Hebron? Why did Absalom want to go to Hebron? Now, I know I can't see your hands raised to answer that, so I'm going to give you the possible reasons he wanted to go to Hebron. For the first thing, well, it was the formal capital of Judah, so it was a prominent city. If you remember in the early parts of 2 Samuel, that's where David began his reign. That's where David was first proclaimed to be king in Hebron, king of Judah. It's also Absalom's birthplace. Absalom was a son of Hebron, so perhaps he thought that would be a good place to build support. Hebron was a sacred city assigned to the Levites, so it had some religious significance. And maybe most importantly was just geographic. Hebron was about 20 miles south of Jerusalem. And if you're staging a rebellion, probably 20 miles was just about right. It was far enough that you could do things under the radar and not be anywhere near Jerusalem in case there was some pushback. But it was close enough that when the time came, he could get to Jerusalem. So for one or some of those reasons, he wanted to go to Hebron. Moving on, verses 10 to 12, we see his conspiracy is born. So he's allowed to go to Hebron. And then let's read starting in verse 10. Then Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men invited from Jerusalem, and they went along innocently and did not know anything. Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy grew strong, for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. So the first thing he does when he goes to Hebron is that he announces his usurpation of power. He sends out spies to all the tribes and arranges for trumpets to blow, and they're to shout, Absalom reigns in Hebron. And he's announcing that he now has a competing monarchy. He's making it public now that I want to be king, and I'm challenging my father to be king. And then we're told that he went with 200 men. 200 men were invited from Jerusalem, no doubt invited by Absalom. So he made sure before he left Jerusalem, he rounded up about 200 officials, people in David's court or in the government, to travel with him. So, and we're told that they were unaware of his ambitions. They just thought they were accompanying the prince to Hebron to pay a vow. But of course, Absalom brought them to give the appearance of power or authority. Remember, Absalom has probably been planning this coup for years. So he has all the details pounded out. And here he arranges to have this 200 officials to go with him, even though they had no clue what was happening. And then to make matters worse, we're told that Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite. And Ahithophel evidently, willingly comes over to support Absalom. What's the significance of that? Who is Ahithophel? Well, Ahithophel was one of David's chief counselors. We know that. Also, if you remember, he's the grandfather of Bathsheba. So there's some backstory here. Of course, things are still fresh in his mind about the whole Bathsheba Uriah incident. And some suggest that maybe Ahithophel thought this was a way to get some revenge on David for all the wrong he did. For whatever reason, Ahithophel is won over and he goes to Absalom and becomes his counselor. And then we're told that more and more people come to Absalom's support in Hebron. You got to wonder why. What would motivate these people to get behind Absalom? They know David is in Jerusalem. He's ruling and reigning and apparently doing a good job. But here you have Absalom, the young prince, good looking, smooth talker, and more people are swayed to get behind Absalom. Well, Absalom is there, whereas David is 20 miles away. They are being swayed by his political abilities. And Perhaps they're opportunists. They think, things are looking like Absalom's going to be the next king. Why not get behind him early? Maybe we can get a position. So, for whatever reason, we're told that more and more people get behind Absalom, and Absalom is aggressively challenging David's reign. So, you think about it, Absalom has gone from being an outlaw to now a self proclaimed king. That's quite a jump. So, like I said, he obviously was a charismatic individual and was able to influence people. So that's how he stages his rebellion from Hebron. Now, normally, like I said, I would stop here and ask for comments and questions. But like I said, in 2 weeks, we'll be covering the rest of the chapter after we're done today. And I'll review what we've covered today. And I'll give opportunities for questions or comments. So if you have one of those, jot it down. And in 2 weeks, we'll let you make that comment or ask that question. So we're going to move on then to the next part of the chapter. So starting in verse 13 to the end of the chapter, we read about David's escape. So Absalom has set up himself as king in Hebron. Now we see what David's reaction is. Now David, no doubt, even if he was in a weakened condition, he was probably monitoring the situation as it developed. Remember, communication was a little slower back then, but it's only 20 miles away. So no doubt he was getting news about what Absalom was doing in Hebron. In fact, we're told, starting in verse 13, now a messenger came to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. So David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servants said to the king, we are your servants, ready to do whatever my lord the king commands. Then the king went out with all his household after him, but the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. So news of a strong and growing conspiracy reached David, and he realizes the situation. And David takes action. David accepts the real possibility that Absalom is planning a violent takeover. Remember, he had already killed Amnon, his half-brother. And no doubt David knew he was capable of killing his other brothers and possibly David himself to reach his ambition. So David decides immediately to flee. Now, the first question you might be thinking is, why not stay and fight? I mean, David is an experienced ruler. He's an experienced soldier. He's a military man. He has a strong army. Why not stay and fight? Well, the answer is in verse 14. Evidently, David is not interested in a civil war. It says in verse 14, arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. David wants to spare the people and the city. He is not interested in the city and the people in the city being destroyed because of Absalom's treason. And again, maybe David's in poor health. He's in no position to lead a resistance to Absalom. But for whatever reason, he prepares to leave with his royal household. And we're told that he leaves 10 women to keep the house. So he leaves a skeleton crew to take care of the palace and the buildings. Everyone else prepares to leave with him. Then continuing in verse 17, and the king went out with all the people after him and stopped at the outskirts. Then all his servants passed before him, and all the Cherethites, all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. So David leaves with all his household, with all his followers, and he stops just outside of the city, and then his servants and soldiers pass by him in support, kind of like he's reviewing the ranks. Then we're told about some certain subgroups of soldiers. We're told about the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Now, these were the personal bodyguard of King David. So these were the units of men who were kind of like the elite guard. They were the ones that were tasked with protecting the king. If you've ever read or seen the movies about the Three Musketeers, that's what the Musketeers were. They were tasked with protecting the king. That's what these men were. They were the Musketeers of King David's time. And they were loyal to him. They were traveling with him. Then we're told about 600 Gittites. Who were 600 Gittites? We're told that they were from Gath. Where is Gath? Well, Gath is a Philistine city. So these are not only they're Gentiles, but they're Philistines. So there's a group of 600 men who they are the men that gathered around David when he was in hiding from Saul for many years. Remember, several years he stayed in Philistia. He stayed in the Philistine cities. And while he was there, he amassed an army, and there were 600 of Philistines, Gittites, who followed him. And when he left there and eventually ended up in Jerusalem, they followed him. So this is a group of 600 men who followed him from Gath, and they were following him in support. So you see, David had a wide base of support. Many of the Jews followed him, of course, but there were also Gentiles that were loyal to David. So David had a broad base of support. So they're making their way out. Then we're told in verses 19 to 22 a conversation that he has with Ittai. So let's continue on. Verse 19. It says, "Then the king said to Ittai the Gittite," so he's one of those from Gath, "Why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today, since I go I know not where? Return and take your brethren back. Mercy and truth be with you." But Ittai answered the king and said, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be." So David said to Ittai, "Go and cross over." Then Ittai the Gittite and all his men and all the little ones who were with him crossed over. So Ittai is evidently a Gittite officer who had just recently arrived from Gath, and he came to serve with these 600 men. And David makes an interesting statement. He says, "Why don't you stay and get in a good position with this new king?" Let me read that verse from the NIV, because I think it's a little clearer. It says, "The king said to Ittai the Gittite, 'Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You are a foreigner in exile from your homeland.'" It almost sounds like David is conceding already, and he's saying, "Look, Absalom's coming. He's going to be the king. Why don't you stay and serve him like you served me?" Again, David doesn't seem to be offering any resistance. He's almost conceding that Absalom is coming. He's probably going to become the new king. But then Ittai, his response, remember, he's not a Jew. He's not Jewish. He's a Gentile, but he insists that he will honor his commitment. And he says that my commitment is not to the Jewish king, it's to you, King David. He says there in verse 21, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be." He says that his commitment is to King David, and he will go with him in exile and death if necessary. This doesn't sound like a mercenary. He wasn't in it for the money. He says, "No, we committed to follow you and to serve you. We'll go wherever you go, even if it means death." True loyalty. What a great encouragement that probably was to David. I mean, isn't that just like God when things are going bad and we're really maybe being tempted to lose hope? God does something to encourage our hearts. And that must have been a great encouragement for David, for this Gentile officer to say, "No, I'm not going to stay. We're going to follow you and stay with you no matter what." So David, I'm sure, is encouraged by that. And then lastly, in verse 23, lastly for today, it says, and all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. The king himself also crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. So a bunch of people went. 3 times in this verses we see all. It says all the country wept with a loud voice. All the people crossed over. And then again, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. So this was a large group. This is a huge group leaving the city with David. It's all his servants, all his soldiers, and apparently most of the residents that could travel from Jerusalem are going with David. And we're told that they go with weeping. So with weeping, the king and all his followers head into the wilderness. You got to think that David must have thought before this that his days of hiding out in the wilderness were over. Well, here we have, after he's been king for many years, now he's headed back to the wilderness, kind of like his home away from home. He doesn't know for how long, he doesn't know what awaits him, but he goes. And I want to close this section again. We'll pick up here in 2 weeks. But there is one psalm that we know is attributed to this time in David's life, and that's Psalm chapter 3. If you'll turn to Psalm 3. Now, the heading in my Bible says Psalm 3, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. So we're quite sure David wrote this as he was fleeing into the wilderness. I just want to read the first couple verses. Just to show you that David, although he was under great difficulty, great trial, he hadn't given up hope. He says, Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. So even though David is despairing, he's fleeing, almost seems like he's giving up. He knows the odds are against him. He knows that he's in God's hands, and that's where he's willing to rest. And what a great encouragement for us when we face difficulties. Okay, I hope that was a blessing to you, and we'll pick up there. We'll review what we talked about today, but we'll finish the rest of the chapter and see a little more about who goes with David as he flees Jerusalem. So thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.